Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. You're watching India Tonight with me, Samita Karir. Our top story tonight, while President-elect Donald Trump has threatened 100% tariffs on BRIC nations, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China and others, if they act to undermine the US dollar. The bloc, remember, has been promoting alternatives to the dollar's dominance. In fact, this is a process that's known as de-dollarization. There are calls for a new payment system and non-dollar trade. Trump, in a fiery Truth Social post, has warned that any new country that backs a new BRICS currency would, quote-unquote, wave goodbye to the US market. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin has accused the United States of, quote-unquote, weaponizing the dollar, urging alternatives to bypass Western sanctions. Meanwhile, the rupee today depreciated 13 paise and closed at an all-time low of 84.73 against the US dollar. The further slide in rupee against the US dollar is being attributed on disappointing macroeconomic data and broad strength of the American currencies in the overseas markets. In fact, foreign traders also cited how Asian currencies were witnessing a downward trend after Trump's warning over BRICS currency. So let's take this up, this issue of de-dollarization and whether that's a viability. And can BRICS countries really de-dollarize the global financial ecosystem? Let's take that across to our stellar panel tonight. Joining us tonight is Mr. Ajay Dua, former Commerce Secretary in the Government of India, Manoj Joshi, Distinguished Fellow ORF, and Pankaj, Mohindroo, Chairman ICEA. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us this evening on ET Now. Let me come to you, Mr. Dua, first. If there was one big story that came out of BRICS meet a couple of months back, it was a pitch that was raised by President Putin against de-dollarization, ably supported by China. Now, Donald Trump, as we can see, is setting, stage for his presidency, and we're seeing one bombshell announcement after another. But on de-dollarization, does the US have reasons to worry, or is this a non-starter completely?
Thank you very much for having me on the show. I would say that there is no basis for it whatsoever. If you recall the Kazan BRICS conference, what was mentioned there was President Putin was not de-dollarization, but that if sanctions get imposed upon certain nations, then they need to work their way around the dollar to remain in business, remain in trade. That was said. There was no agenda item whatsoever. I'm pretty categorical about it, having checked the facts, that the discussion was on this subject rather than on moving away from the dollar in the global trade. Because no sensible person as of now can talk about it, because the dollar, the US dollar, dominates the world trade, almost 90% of it, and 100% of the oil trade is in dollars. Similarly, down from 72% post the World War, but now, even now, 59% of the reserves of all the central banks of the world is also held in dollars. So moving away from it, even if it was resolved for a moment by the BRICS nations, would have taken years of hard work, and that too, it would have happened only partially. Dollar continues to dominate the world and would continue for quite some time, despite whatever anybody might say. Example, all that renminbi the Chinese have been able to do is to take the trade forward from 1% to 3% in the last few years in dollar terms, but they also continue to deal with dollars.
Right.
The talk there was national currencies. That can we be trading in the national, not a BRIC currency, national currencies like India and Russia are trading in their respective currencies for oil.
Right.
China and Russia have started
and absolutely,
doing the same
India and
thing.
UAE are also.
Yes, so we are doing it. And we are also doing it with
And India is exploring those kind of arrangements with several other countries, Mr. Dua. Point taken, this is not really a realistic threat, is the point that Mr. Dua is stating. Mr. Mohindroo, I want to get in your comments on whether you'd agree with that, and how practical is this idea, given that 60% of global forex reserves are in dollar terms. And if that happens, if at all that happens, if not immediately, but maybe in the near future sometime, which currency really takes the dollar's place?
I just agree with Mr. Dua that there is no substitute for the dollar. India's destiny and future is tied, our economic growth, industrial growth is tied to selling into the US, which is a 3.5 trillion import market. Uh, we should aim for hitting $500 billion of exports to the US. I think that will lift the Indian economy up. Uh, what Mr. Dua said is absolutely the fact that we were never in this discussion of that, you know, kind of a Instagram sort of thing which came out that there is a BRICS currency and something like that was floated. Uh, it is inconceivable that India can be a part of any uh, supposedly BRICS currency in which our neighbor is dominating with more than 70% share of the GDP of that grouping. It is, I think it what the president-elect has said is uh, is okay, but I think there's nothing which India should worry about, and we are not in collision with
All right.
anything even close to that. So our relationship with US is extremely valuable, and we have settled all the trade disputes with the
Right.
US. Any perception of high tariffs or India being a tariff champion, etc., is also something which is what was there many years back.
Right.
We are scaling down,
Yes.
and it is important. We
Yes.
have realized, we've understood, and
Yes.
ICA has always perpetuated this fact that high tariffs are a double-edged sword. We have to become a global
Right, sir.
economy, to
Right.
have a
Right.
big share in the global, especially the electronic trade.
Absolutely.
We need to have, very
Right, sir.
low tariffs, and we are going in that
Right.
direction. So I think this
Right.
is misplaced here.
Absolutely, Mr. Mohindroo, and you worked in that regard and you continue to do so. Point taken on that. But let me also get in Mr. Putin's comment during the BRICS summit. He said, and I quote, the dollar is being used as a weapon. We rarely see that this is so. I think it's a big mistake by those who do this. This was endorsed by China. However, India, on the other hand, Dr. S. Shankar, India's External Affairs Minister, has said that de-dollarization is not part of India's economic policy or strategy. India has explored alternatives when trade partners do not really accept the dollar. Mr. Joshi, thanks very much for patiently waiting. I want to understand from you, one could very well understand the kind of commentary that's being made by Donald Trump before elections because he wanted to win on the back of protectionism. But what explains Trump's aggressive stance now? And will Trump seriously be looking at, tariffs related to de-dollarization? Will this be one of his priorities when he begins his term in January?
See, this is something which has suddenly come up. This was not there earlier. In some of his speeches, he has spoken of this issue of de-dollarization. We know, of course, that he has spoken of tariffs, and recently he has even announced that tariffs will be placed on Mexico and Canada, as well as China. But the thing is that he has several ends in view. You see, what Trump would like is that he wants to reduce the US trade deficit, and as well as increase the dominance of the dollar, which is the contradictory kind of a situation. Because if you want to reduce the trade deficit, you've got to ensure that you are able to import stuff and export stuff. And that requires a dollar which is not too strong. But the problem with Trump is he thinks in in a kind of a strong man sense, in the sense, I want a strong dollar. But strong dollar is not a good thing. And so I don't know how far.
Right. So, Mr. Dua.
First of all, Mr. Dua has already pointed out that this is an unlikely.
Okay. So, Mr. Dua, let me. Right. Mr. Dua, let me take that point across to you. I mean, Mr. Joshi is saying that, of course, the United States and particularly Trump wants a stronger dollar. So what kind of decisions do you really see Trump making once he assumes office? And second part to this question is, do you really see the preference for dollar declining globally?
I'm sorry, I missed the second part of your question.
So do you think that the preference for the dollar is declining globally?
Yes, the answer to the second part is yes, it is declining, but very slowly, gradually. Nothing is going to happen overnight. The dollar represents today its biggest advantage for the US is that most of the currency of the banks, as I mentioned, central banks, is held in dollar terms, and that means those dollars get invested in the US treasuries. So the US Treasury has to offer its bonds at very low rates of interest because the demand for it goes up when everybody wants to invest in the US. Even China today has as much as $3.6 trillion of its reserves invested in treasury bonds of the US. So it's not so even China is not wanting to walk away because easily, like the Russia's $600 billion were frozen by the US at the beginning of the Ukraine war. If anything China does or US thinks that it's not playing fair, it can freeze these $3.6 trillion, which is equal to the GDP of India. So having said that, I would say that I do not, but at the same time, I do not expect President Trump to act on what he has said in a comment because it's going to hurt the US. As Mr. Manoj Joshi so rightly said, the US exports will become costly. If the US dollar continues to become strong, then the US exports will not be competitive in the global market. Imports might be because the imports, he's putting a duty on it, etc. And but the fact will remain that a strong dollar straight away means the US customer would suffer. Second, he also carries out this threat of 100%, and the goods become available to the US citizens, consumers, that will be a double the cost at what it's being imported because there is a 100% duty. So both ways, he would be doing a disservice to the US citizens rather than in any way helping himself or his citizens. So my answer is an affirmative, saying he will not carry forward his threat. He has said that, but something natural is always happening. As I mentioned, down from 73% of the reserves of the world in post-Second World War, now down to 59%. Over time, new currency, reserves are today being held in euros, in British pound, and 3% in renminbi, and a little bit in the Japanese yen also. So other alternate reserve currencies will emerge always, but only a small share will go, at least in foreseeable future. What happens in the very long run, no one can predict.
Mr. Dua. Right, Mr. Dua. Mr. Joshi, let me come to you at this point. If you remember what US Secretary Janet Yellen had said, and as a warning that the dollar could ultimately be cast aside as the world's dominant currency, she said that if the United States is capricious with sanctions and acts unilaterally, it is the US then, sir, which really needs to clean up its act, doesn't it, for acting unilaterally and with that kind of capriciousness?
Well, that is true, meaning this whole US tendency to put sanctions on various countries. And frankly, I'm not so sure those sanctions actually work. I'm saying you look at what is happening with the sanctions on Russia, meaning there are sanctions on Russian oil, but Russian oil is bypassing those sanctions and is being sold. We are buying it. Many other people are buying it. So this whole US strategy of imposing sanctions, it may give them some satisfaction that they are punishing the other side, but often it doesn't quite work that way. Meaning, in fact, even in the case of Russia, what they are really doing is that they have pushed Russia towards China, to some extent even towards India, meaning the Russians are trading more with us than they would have otherwise. So I'm not so sure about this whole sanction strategy of the United States. I don't quite think it's working. Yes, in the case of Iran, for example, Iran is undergoing a lot of difficulty. And I think uh, Trump will continue with that maximum pressure strategy with Iran. But Iran has also got powerful friends like China and like Russia who will help it out.
Yes.
It's only countries like India which have to be very careful that we don't cross the United States in any way.
Right.
It can cost us a lot.
Right. Right. Right, Mr. Joshi. Let me come to you, Mr. Mohindroo. Now, realistically, what action do you foresee on the tariffs front, given that this is, the rhetoric that is being carried on not just during his campaign timing, but in the past few days as well? He's mentioned that he will slap these kind of tariffs on China. Of course, India was not really proactively mentioned. But given that this was definitely a possibility and did happen during Trump's last presidency, wherein retaliatory tariffs were then slapped, Harley and several other, sectors. But how much do you think India could be impacted? And is this something that we must ourselves brace for right now, policymakers per se?
No, we have to be proactive. Our economic diplomacy has to be at its best. Uh, the tariffs of the Trump 1.0, whatever happened, I think India has cleaned the stables. All the trade issues have got sorted out. And that's a wonderful thing. We have sorted out all trade issues. There are certain perception issues about India. Actually, we have over the last decade and a half, our tariffs have gone up because we had peak tariffs about 7.5% on most commodities uh, in, say, about a decade back, and we have increased them. So, but that doesn't make us a tariff king. It is more about perception. So, a lot of economic diplomacy has to get involved there. We can only gain. And as I said, the $500 billion target to export to the US is something which can lift the Indian economy up and lift many sectors up: electronics, mobile phones, footwear, consumer products, etc. All of that, India can be the next destination after China. And that is not because, China is threatened or anything like that. India is becoming more competitive, and we are a free country, we are a democratic country, our values are similar. So I see the world moving towards this direction. And I have highest respect for Mr. Joshi, but I would like to say that the sanctions are really hurting Russia. I mean, there's a lot of bluster, etc. But when we talk to the associations there, associations in electronics, software, etc., they are hurting very badly, and uh, the whole economic scenario gets completely shrunken. You, it is not possible to fight with the US and risk any kind of sanctions, etc. So that is something as a practitioner, I understand that because we are talking to these people and understanding how they are suffering. And the Russian people are suffering
Right, sir.
because, for
Right, sir.
example, you can't have
Right, sir.
the operating system on a laptop, for example. That's the kind of damage
Yes.
which
Yes.
US sanctions inflict. Uh,
Right, so but I believe that the US is not really, maybe, and you may disagree with me on that, is not really in a position to unilaterally slap tariffs, especially when the world is so connected and when there are parallel power centers really emerging, geopolitics is changing. Let me come to you, Mr. Dua. Now, Trump's aggressive stance on tariffs definitely, as has been spoken about in the recent past as well, it could reshape global trade environment. There could be some bit of a slowdown. But when President Trump takes over as president once again, what do you see his business priorities, realistically speaking, minus the loud rhetoric that we are listening to and we are seeing coming out from his side?
As I see my crystal ball, gaze through it, I think his first step is going to be make a move towards reducing the taxes, direct taxes in particular. He would bring it down because his voters, the Republicans, they all look forward to a regime of lower taxations. He would certainly address that issue. Second, I expect him to be able to address himself in the context of getting a hand at global diplomacy, both in Ukraine as well as in the war in the Middle East. And if towards that he has to use his economic leverage, the economic leverage of the US, he would not hesitate in doing that, because on that he's been talking ever since he started his campaign in September or before that, well before that I should say. September was his opponent. But he would certainly take action on those fronts, because he said he'll stop the war in one day in Ukraine and be able to effect a ceasefire very quickly there. But at the same time, he's going to link up the tariffs with immigration policy of his, on which again he's going to be very strong, because people are migrating from Mexico and Canada in that order. So there he could well be using the threat of tariff, which he's talked about, that he'll impose 15% tariff on both the countries.
And so many economic experts have criticized that policy of linking security to, of course, tariffs, because, it is the United States in itself which could get hurt and could get impacted in the end. Let me take closing comments from you, Mr. Joshi. While high tariffs do carry this fear of weaker exports and economic concerns, something that recently ECB and WTO have also sounded, but how do you think India can navigate its relationship with Trump 2.0?
I definitely think we can, and we'll have to. I think that, let's be very clear on that. We do need to do that. I think we are quite clear-headed on that. I think one important thing that we need to look at is that if you look at the balance in the Congress, what do you find? You find that there are while the Republicans have 53 senators as against 47 for the Democrats, and they have 220 House representatives as against 215. So it's a very narrow situation there. And you have some moderate Republicans who are willing to go against many of the Trump's policies. So I think we'll have to watch very carefully that there are some guardrails, there are institutional guardrails. So whatever Trump may be saying now, this may be an opening move, a kind of his classic style of negotiation. He's negotiating. So all the tariff and all this business is basically to set out a negotiating position.
Absolutely. Very well, sir. Very well said, sir, that this could be definitely Trump's way of setting the stage for his presidency 2.0. On that note, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us.
If you like this video, then like, share and subscribe to ET Now.